The wagon wheels creaked over the cracked earth, their mournful song rising into the thick, peach-colored twilight. Dust clung to the hems of her dress, clotted at the corners of her eyes, settled like fine sorrow in her lungs. Ella May sat stiff-backed on the worn seat, one hand fisting the edge of her mother's shawl, the other cradling a battered letter that had grown thin from so much touching. The road ahead was little more than a suggestion, a thread pulled loose across a vast and empty tapestry. Her mother's words clung to her mind like the last leaves of autumn, trembling but stubborn. Go, Ellie. Make a life where no one knows the pieces you've had to pick up. Find a place the past can't follow. The horses pulled steadily, their ribs shifting like shadows beneath their skin, and the town at the horizon grew clearer, less a hope and more a certainty she could no longer run from. Ella May swallowed against the tightness in her throat. She was no one's dream. Not even her mother's, not really. Only a stand-in, a desperate replacement sent west to honor a promise her mother could no longer keep. She thought of the way her mother's hands had trembled as she pressed the letter into her palms, her breath rattling thinly in a body that had given everything it had. The town looked smaller up close. Dull wooden fronts slumped against each other like tired old men, windows squinting into the fading light. A general store with a sun-bleached awning. A saloon leaking laughter too thick and loud. A church spire tilted ever so slightly to one side, like even the heavens had grown weary of standing straight. She climbed down awkwardly when the wagon jerked to a stop in front of the station house. Her knees wobbled, her feet uncertain. Men leaned against the railing, idly chewing tobacco, hats tipped low against the heat. Eyes found her quickly, ran over her like tally marks on a ledger. Jeb Carter stood apart from them, tall and wide and full of the kind of certainty that did not welcome questions. His boots were polished. His mustache trimmed neat. His arms crossed over his chest in a manner that said he had already made up his mind about whatever lay ahead. A man who believed himself owed something simply because he had asked. Ella May approached, the letter trembling in her hand. She held it out like a peace offering, her voice soft, nearly swallowed by the rattle of the dry wind. Sir, my name's Ella May. My mother Ruth, she fell ill. She couldn't make the journey. She sent me in her place. She spoke of the arrangements. I've come to honor them. Jeb Carter didn't take the letter. His eyes sharpened like broken glass. His mouth twisted. You're not her, he said, voice flat as a blade. She was a woman full-grown, hardy, capable. You're a scrap. The words hit harder than fists. Around them, the small crowd shifted, eager for the spectacle, eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger that only surfaced when someone else's pain promised a momentary escape from their own. I can work, she said quickly, heart hammering. I can learn. I'm strong, truly. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Strong? Girl, you look like a stiff breeze might break you clean in half. I sent for a wife, not another mouth to feed. The letter slipped from her fingers, forgotten in the dust. She wanted to explain, to plead, but pride rooted her feet to the earth. She had been sent here not to beg but to build. And if he could not see the worth stitched quietly into her bones, then he never would. Jeb Carter turned on his heel, spat into the dirt, and walked away without a backward glance. The murmuring grew louder. A few women clucked their tongues. A man laughed under his breath. Someone muttered, "Fool girl, thinkin' she could trick him." Ella May bent slowly, gathering the letter with fingers that shook too much. She tucked it back into her shawl, her mother's shawl, a fragile armor against the gaping loneliness spreading through her chest. No room at the inn for charity cases, the woman behind the counter said when Ella May inquired. Not without payment. Triple maybe for the trouble. She wandered the edges of the town until she found a shed left to rot behind the livery. It leaned dangerously against the night, ribs bared where planks had split. But it was shelter of a sort. She curled up on a pile of old horse blankets, the smell of leather and old hay thick around her. The stars wheeled slowly above, vast and cold, indifferent to the small ruin of a girl below. Somewhere an owl called out, low and mournful. The wind slipped through the cracks in the shed like an old woman's sigh. Ella May pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, rocking slightly, humming tunelessly under her breath. She remembered her mother's lullaby, the one sung on nights when the world seemed too wide and cruel for a little girl to bear. She remembered her mother's voice whispering, "Not all things that break stay broken." Tears slid down the sides of her face, quiet as prayer beads slipping through fingers. She let them come. There was no one left to see. No one left to pretend for. The morning would come, harsh and bright. The town would find its next entertainment. She would find a way to survive because the only other choice was not to, and Ella May had never been much good at giving up. She closed her eyes, the dust of 100 hard miles still clinging to her skin. In the distance, the town exhaled and settled, a beast at uneasy rest. Somewhere out there, she thought dimly, maybe there was a place where the soil wasn't so dry, where a girl like her could plant something and watch it grow. Somewhere, but not here. Not yet. The stars kept their silent vigil as she drifted into a restless sleep, one hand curled tight around the letter she had traveled so far to deliver and the other pressed over her heart as if to keep it from slipping away into the night. And somewhere just beyond the sleeping town, a man watched from the shadows, his hat low over his brow, his breath rising in slow, steady clouds. He saw the girl abandoned like a stray dog, and though he said no words, something within him shifted, ancient and slow, like a river finding a new course after a long drought. But that is a story for another dawn. The town woke with the sun, all hard edges and busy hands, but no one spared a glance for the girl picking her way out of the abandoned shed, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. Ella May moved carefully, head low, dust rising from her skirts in soft little clouds. She wore her silence like a second skin now, learned overnight how to slip unnoticed between the corners of things. The streets buzzed with the small violences of daily life. A merchant haggled too sharply over a sack of beans. A boy kicked a dog hard enough to make it yelp. A woman snapped at her daughter for dawdling. Ella May felt each sound like a stone in her pocket, weighing her down with things that had no name but pressed heavy all the same. At the general store, the clerk looked through her like she was glass. She counted out the coins her mother had hidden in the hem of her dress, her fingers clumsy from cold. Enough for a tin of beans, a few matches, a heel of bread going stale on the counter. The clerk made a noise low in his throat, the kind men made when they felt inconvenienced by your very breathing. Behind her in the narrow store, someone moved, solid and slow. She didn't turn. She had learned not to turn. Eyes brought trouble. When she placed her few sad purchases on the counter, her hands shook slightly. The clerk rang them up without looking at her, announced the cost in a voice as dry as a chalkboard. Her coins did not stretch far enough. She fumbled for the extra, her heart knocking against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't notice when another hand, large, calloused, slipped a small silver coin onto the counter. The clerk shrugged, made no comment, slid the goods into a paper bag. Ella May turned then, just enough to glimpse the man behind her. He was tall, sparely built, his clothes plain and well-worn, his hat shadowing his face. He didn't look at her. Didn't even seem to expect thanks. He simply nodded once, slow as the sun rising, and moved past her into the morning light. She carried the bag close to her chest, confused, wary, but warmed in some corner of her chest that had gone cold. The town saw her, but only through the crooked lens of rumor. It didn't matter that she had spoken no lies. It didn't matter that her hands were willing, that her heart had stayed soft despite the breaking. In their eyes, she was a trickster, a girl who had tried to pass herself off as something she was not. Children pointed sometimes. Old men muttered. Women clucked their tongues and turned away as she passed. She found small work where she could. Washing laundry for the widow who ran the boarding house. Sweeping floors at the livery. Carrying parcels too heavy for the shop boys. No one paid her well, but pennies stacked slow could still make a tower if you were patient enough. At night she returned to the shed. It was hers now, in a way marked by the little scraps of life she left behind. A chipped cup, a patchwork blanket stitched from discarded rags, a sprig of wild sage stuck into a crack in the wall. Sometimes she cried, but mostly she simply sat and listened to the night sounds. The lowing of cattle beyond the fields. The restless whisper of the grass. The far-off sound of a harmonica rising and falling like breath. And sometimes, when the moon was thin and sharp as a sliver of bone, she caught sight of him, the man from the store, moving through town with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to rush. Always quiet. Always alone. She asked the widow about him once, her voice no more than a thread of sound. Calder Boone, the widow said, scrubbing a dish with more force than necessary. Lost a wife years back. Ain't much for talking. Keeps to himself. The way she said it made it sound like a flaw, but Ella May thought maybe it was just a way of surviving. She knew something about that. She saw him again 2 mornings later. She was hanging laundry behind the boarding house, arms aching from the work, when he passed by leading a tired old mule. He tipped his hat to her, not smiling, not expectant, just a simple acknowledgement. A quiet thing, but it filled the space around her like sunlight slipping into a cold room. She didn't dare hope. Hope was a luxury for girls who still had fathers and soft beds and names that carried respect. Still, when the town looked at her like a stain that wouldn't wash out, Calder Boone looked at her like she was simply a person. Not a burden. Not a disappointment. just a person. One evening, a loaf of fresh bread appeared on the steps of the shed. No note. No explanation. She found herself smiling despite the ache that lived deep in her bones now. Another time, when her old boots split at the seams, she discovered a pair of nearly new ones tucked behind the shed, sized just right. She never caught him at it. That felt important somehow, the way he gave without asking for gratitude, the way he understood how sometimes kindness needed to be quiet to be real. Summer deepened its claws into the land. The river shrank, the fields turned brittle and yellow. Tempers in town grew short as water grew scarce. But Calder Boone remained steady as a fence post in a hard wind. She learned to watch for him the way one watches for rain clouds in a drought, with cautious, yearning hope. He was not handsome in the way Jeb Carter had been, not polished or sharp. His face was weathered, lined from years of squinting into the sun, but his eyes, when you caught them, were steady and kind and terribly lonely. She wondered what it would be like to sit across a table from him, to speak without flinching, to be seen and not judged. She wondered if such things were meant for girls like her. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, she sat by the shed door, sewing a patch onto her dress by the last scraps of daylight. Calder Boone passed by, leading the mule again, and paused. "You sew," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. She nodded, throat too tight for words. "I got some shirts need mending," he said after a long moment. "Pay you fair." She swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded again. "Bring 'em by tomorrow," she managed to say. He touched the brim of his hat and moved on. The night wrapped itself around her like a shawl woven from hope and fear. She stitched the final thread into her dress with hands that shook not from weariness this time, but from something altogether more dangerous. Possibility. The town might turn its face away from her, might close its doors and whisper behind cupped hands. But out there, beyond the cracked road and the bent spire of the church, something was waiting. Something slow and patient and steady as the stars wheeling overhead. Someone, who saw her not as a mistake, not as a fraud, but simply as a soul trying to make a life in a world that had never made space for her. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ella May dared to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was worth being seen. The bundle of shirts arrived the next morning, folded neatly in a canvas sack and left by the shed door, as if even the delivery was meant to spare her pride. Ella May ran her fingers over the worn fabric, calloused fingertips catching on tears and frayed edges. Shirts that had seen long days in the fields, shirts that carried the faint scent of wood smoke and wild sage. She worked carefully, each stitch a small act of stubborn hope. She mended them with the same care her mother had once used mending their clothes back east, not simply repairing cloth, but stitching dignity back into worn seams. When Calder Boone returned 2 days later, he stood a ways off, as if unsure whether he was truly welcome. Ella May stepped out of the shed with the shirts folded over her arm and offered them up without a word. He nodded once, slow, solemn, the kind of nod that carried more weight than whole conversations. "Good work," he said simply, passing her a small pouch heavy with coins. She should have refused. Pride and caution warred within her. But something steadier, something hungrier, rose up and took her hand instead. She accepted the pouch and murmured a thank you so quiet it might have been the breeze. After that, it became a rhythm between them. Calder brought small tasks, mending, gardening, feeding the chickens that scratched behind his modest house, and Ella May met each one with quiet determination. Not because she wanted to earn his approval, but because the work, small as it was, made her feel anchored again, made her feel real in a world that had done its best to unmake her. His ranch sat on the edge of town, where the land stretched out into gold and gray and brittle green. The house was plain but sturdy like its owner. A deep porch wrapped around the front, shaded by a roof that groaned and whispered in the wind. Ella May learned the small geography of his world, the way the front gate squeaked low and tired, the path worn into the grass from years of quiet footsteps, the gnarled cottonwood tree that stood like a lone sentinel by the well. Calder spoke little, but when he did, his words came honest and unvarnished, like river stones worn smooth by time. "Need anything you ask?" he said one day, setting a sack of flour down by the shed. "No shame in needing." She didn't know how to answer, so she nodded, blinking back the sudden burn behind her eyes. Some evenings, when the heat pressed down heavy and unrelenting, Calder would sit on his porch with a battered guitar across his knee, picking out slow, mournful tunes that seemed to rise straight up into the stars. Ella May listened from her little shed, the music threading through the night like a promise she didn't yet dare name. Sometimes he would glance over, catch her watching, and she would look away quickly, heart thudding loud enough to rattle her ribs. But he never called her out for it. Never mocked or questioned. just kept playing, letting the music build a bridge between them without ever demanding she cross it. There were moments, scattered and shining like pebbles in a dry creek bed, when the hardness in her chest softened. When the world felt less like a set of closed doors and more like a field just waiting for seeds brave enough to root. She began to plant things. Tiny rebellions against the dry soil and harsher odds. A row of sunflowers along the side of the shed. A patch of mint near the well. Tomatoes, stubborn and slow but growing all the same. The town still looked at her sideways. Still muttered when she passed. But she found she could meet their eyes now without flinching. Found she could wear her mother's shawl not as armor, but as memory, a badge of the battles already survived. One late afternoon, after a long day mending a torn fence line, Calder offered her a seat on the porch. Just a gesture, a tilt of his head toward the extra chair he had dragged out into the shade. Ella May hesitated, the old reflex to refuse, to flee flickering up in her chest. But the porch was wide, the sky above it endless and forgiving, and Calder Boone sat easy as a man with no need for games. She sat. They watched the sun sink low together, the sky bleeding colors too fierce and beautiful to be real. After a long while, Calder spoke, voice slow as honey. "Folks think you're trouble." She stiffened, ready to retreat behind the careful wall she had built, but he continued before she could. "They're wrong." 3 words. Nothing more. But they sank into her bones deeper than any kindness had in months. She looked at him, then really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the rough hands that had built something steady out here on the edge of nowhere, the quiet weight of his gaze that saw her, not for what she wasn't, but for what she was. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat like birds startled into flight. He shrugged, a small, almost embarrassed motion. "Just saying what's true." They sat there until the stars bled into the sky, until the night grew thick and tender around them. The next morning, a small wooden box appeared by the shed. Inside, seeds. Handwritten labels in Calder's rough, careful script. Marigold, sage, beans, squash. Hope spelled out in small, steady letters. She planted them with shaking hands, tears slipping down her cheeks and watering the dry earth. The land was stubborn. Hard to coax, harder still to trust. But Ella May knew something about stubbornness, about putting down roots even when the world seemed to conspire against you. As the days stretched into weeks, the seeds took hold. Tiny shoots fought their way through the cracked soil, reaching for the sun with desperate, joyous strength. And so did she. Each evening, Calder and Ella May sat on the porch, the silence between them no longer heavy with things unsaid, but easy, companionable. Sometimes he played his guitar. Sometimes she hummed along, the notes slipping into the cooling air like small blessings. Once, as she mended a tear in his shirt by the firelight, he reached out and touched her hand. A fleeting brush, nothing more, but it lit something in her so fierce and sudden that she had to bow her head to hide it. He didn't pull away. He just let his hand rest there, warm and solid and real. And for the first time in her life, Ella May realized that love, real love, was not a thunderclap or a whirlwind or a desperate reaching. It was a hand offered quietly in the dark. It was a seed planted in dry earth, patient and stubborn and sure. It was a life built one slow, steady moment at a time. She squeezed his hand back, heart hammering, hope blooming wild and stubborn inside her chest. The town would talk. The world would keep turning hard and careless. But here, on the edge of all that noise, something true was growing. Something fierce. Something beautiful. Something theirs. The fire crackled low between them, throwing long, wavering shadows across the porch. The stars lay thick and heavy overhead, so close it seemed a man could pluck one from the sky if he dared reach far enough. Ella May sat with her knees drawn up beneath her skirt, the worn shawl draped over her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke clinging to her hair. Across the small fire, Calder Boone leaned back in his chair, his hat pushed low over his brow, his hands idle for once, resting easy on his knees. The air between them was warm, easy, filled with the quiet music of a life not rushed. And for a while that was enough. But the world beyond their small circle was not so easily kept at bay. Trouble came on a morning stitched with gold and the faint smell of rain. A rider kicking up dust along the road, his horse lathered and skittish, his voice sharp with self-importance as he barked at the townsfolk gathering near the store. Jeb Carter, back from some cattle run, heard tell of the girl he had spurned finding shelter with the likes of Calder Boone. Whispers flared to life like dry grass catching flame. Whispers of impropriety, of deception, of stolen promises. Ella May heard it first in the way the storekeeper stiffened when she entered, the way the widow's son no longer waved as she passed, the way the blacksmith's wife turned her face away, pretending not to see. Rumors grew wild and ugly in dry places, and there was no drought fiercer than the one that lived in men's small, mean hearts. By the time Calder came back from the upper pasture, the town had decided to have a meeting. A reckoning, some called it. A public accounting of sins never committed but whispered loud enough to seem real. Ella May sat on the edge of the porch, hands twisting in her lap, fear a bitter stone lodged deep in her throat. She had known this kind of cruelty before, but it still burned, still carved her open in ways she could never quite prepare for. Calder stood beside her, steady as a tree in high wind. He said nothing for a long time, simply placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Then, without hurry, without fear, he saddled his horse and helped her onto the back of it, climbing up behind her like a man simply heading into another long day's work. The town square buzzed like a hive when they arrived. Faces hard, mouths tight, judgment thick in the air. Jeb Carter stood at the center, a smirk curdling his lips, his hands planted on his hips like a man already sure of victory. "This here," Carter barked, waving a hand toward Ella May, "this is a deception, a shame upon our town. Man takes in a stray, sure, but what man tarnishes his name by playing husband without the preacher's word?" The crowd muttered, shifting on their feet, the uneasy movements of people who wanted blood but feared their own reflection. Calder dismounted slow, helped Ella May down with a care so tender it stung. He turned to face the crowd, his hands loose at his sides, his voice quiet but carrying clear over the restless murmur. "I ain't much for speech," Calder said. "Ain't much for towns neither. But I know right from wrong same as any man here." He paused, scanning the faces before him, seeing not just the anger but the fear underneath it, the gnawing hunger to belong to something even if it meant throwing stones at someone else. Ella May didn't trick nobody. She didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't steal. She's done nothing but work honest and live quiet, same as any decent soul should. The muttering grew softer, uncertain. "As for me," Calder continued, voice like iron wrapped in velvet, "I reckon a man's worth ain't in the promises he makes when things are easy. It's in the ones he keeps when things get hard." He stepped closer to Ella May then, standing beside her not as a shield but as a partner, an equal. "I made her a promise even if I never spoke it out loud. That she'd have a home if she wanted it. That she'd have a name she could wear proud. That no hand would raise against her while I drew breath." The silence now was complete, thick and trembling. Jeb Carter spat into the dust, the only sound, but even he seemed to feel the tide turning beneath his feet. Calder turned to Ella May, his eyes steady, the firelight from the blacksmith's forge painting his face in gold and shadow. "If you'll have me," he said, voice low but sure, "I'd like to marry you proper. Not to fix anything. Not to answer any fool mouths in town. Just because I want to." Ella May felt the world tilt under her feet, a slow, gentle shift, as if the earth itself had decided to make room for her at last. Her throat closed, her heart beating so hard she thought it might shatter against her ribs. She stepped forward, close enough to touch him, to see the lines around his mouth, the hope and the fear and the endless patience woven into the way he looked at her. "I would like that," she whispered, the words fluttering out like moths into the dark. Someone in the crowd clapped, a slow, uncertain sound. Another joined, then another, until the town's judgment cracked and fell away, replaced by something quieter, something almost like respect. It was not full acceptance. It was not forgiveness. But it was a beginning. The preacher married them 2 days later, under the wide sky, with only the cottonwoods and the dry earth as their witnesses. Calder wore his best shirt, patched and clean. Ella May wore her mother's shawl, the threads mended but the love intact. They exchanged rings made of braided grass, laughing soft when the wind tried to steal them away. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars bloom one by one across the endless black. Calder's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together like roots entwining beneath the soil. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and wild, but no longer empty. Ella May leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sweat and wood smoke and something that had no name but filled her to the brim. They had planted something in the dry earth, something stubborn and fierce, something that would not break even when the storms came. Love, slow-grown and steadfast. Home, not built of walls but of hearts stitched back together. Hope, whispered into the dark and answered at last. And if you're ever standing at the edge of everything you thought you lost, if the world turns its face away and leaves you to weather the long nights alone, remember this. Sometimes it is the smallest seed planted in the hardest soil that grows the mightiest tree. All you have to do is dare to plant it. All you have to do is dare to believe you are worth the bloom.
The desert held its breath beneath the waning sun, and the wind, slow as a dying prayer, dragged fingers through the copper dust. All around, the earth stretched wide and silent, stitched in mesquite and ghost thorn, bathed in a holy hush. Out there, where the stars would later bloom, unbothered by roofs or rules, a man lay broken. His name was Cully, though even that felt far away now. Blood, thick and dark as rusted water, crusted his thigh. A jagged spearhead had torn the muscle days ago, and the wound festered beneath the bandage of sand and stubbornness. His lips were split. His tongue swelled with thirst. He hadn't moved in hours, save for the breath that clung to him like a stubborn child. His horse had been killed. His tribe, his own kin, had left him for the coyotes. He blinked once at the dying sky. They had called him traitor, not because he had fought poorly, but because he had not finished the raid. Because his knife had faltered when it found a settler child hiding beneath a wagon bench. Because his soul had twisted, and in that twist they saw weakness. So they rode on, and he remained, a blood offering to the land he loved. Somewhere in the stillness, the world stirred. A creak of wooden wheels. A soft clatter of glass in a wicker basket. The sharp whisper of skirts brushing sage. Lena Walker came alone, as she often did. Her eyes, the color of rain clouds, scanned the rocky expanse. She carried no weapon, only a woven basket and a knowledge of roots that could coax health from illness. Her mama had taught her how to listen to plants. Her papa had taught her nothing but how to leave. She walked not as one searching, but as one drawn. And then she saw him, not in the way a person sees danger, but the way one sees something out of place, a dead bird still warm, a coat left hanging in a storm. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in memory. She'd known what it was to be left behind. She approached with slow steps, her heart steady. He lay half-shadowed beneath a sandstone ledge, skin sun-seared, eyes half-lidded, mouth slack. One hand twitched near a broken bough. The other clutched at the earth like he wanted to sink into it. She knelt. The wind whipped her hair into her face. She brushed it back and looked at him closely, as if memorizing him. "You ain't dead," she said, more to herself than to him. His eyelids fluttered. That was all she needed. Water first. The gourd at her side barely held a cupful. She poured it slowly against his lips, waiting between drops. Some spilled down his neck. He swallowed, once, twice, then coughed, a sound like rocks scraping in a basin. "There," she whispered. "That's better." She tore strips from the hem of her own skirt, dipped them in what little water remained, and cleaned the wound. Infection had set in like fire. She could smell it. Her nose wrinkled, but she didn't pull away, not even when his eyes opened fully and locked on hers. Not hostile, not pleading, just there, seeing her. "You'll need help, but I got none but me, so I reckon that'll do." He tried to speak. The effort was futile. His throat was scorched raw. She pressed a hand to his chest, gently, firmly. "Don't waste what breath you got." Then, with strength no one would have guessed of her, she pulled him to her cart, rolled him onto the patched quilt she'd laid down that morning to air out. It smelled of cedar and old smoke. She gritted her teeth as she lifted his legs. He was heavy with pain. He didn't cry out once. The mule shifted, impatient, but she murmured something low and soothing, as if mule and man alike were made of nerves and need. As the cart creaked forward, Lena kept one hand on Cully's shoulder. She sang, under her breath, an old hymn, nearly forgotten. Not for him, not for God, but to keep her own hands from shaking. The sun dropped behind the hills. Purple shadows fell across the dirt like spilled ink. By the time the cabin rose in the distance, dusk had thickened into night. The structure stood crooked at the edge of a dry creek bed. One room, stone chimney, roof patched with tar and stubbornness. Her mama was inside, likely sleeping. The fever came and went these days like an unwanted suitor. Lena guided the cart beside the cabin, hauled Cully down with every ounce of strength left in her, got him onto a straw mattress by the hearth. She lit a lamp, its soft glow painting him in amber. And for a long moment she just looked at him. The face was sharp in places and softened by suffering in others. High cheekbones, thick lashes clumped from sweat. Scars. One ran along his collarbone, another over his ribcage. His chest rose and fell like a storm trying to calm. She sat beside him. "I don't reckon you understand me," she said, eyes on the fire. "But I'm not the kind to watch something die when I can help it, even if the town wouldn't." She rose and brought over her mama's old apothecary box. Her hands worked on instinct, dabbing poultices, sprinkling powdered yarrow, whispering apologies each time he winced. He didn't thank her, but he didn't flinch away. When her mother stirred in the back room, Lena froze. "It's all right, Mama," she called softly. "Just a traveler. Needs rest." No answer. Just the hush of someone too tired to care anymore. She looked back at him. "You can stay till you're healed. After that, we'll see." He blinked again. Slow. He was listening, if nothing else. The next morning came softly. The desert sang its waking song, cicadas, the low moan of the wind, a hawk's cry overhead. Lena sat by the door, darning a stocking. She hadn't slept. Every so often, she glanced over to see if he was still breathing. He was. She made porridge, watered the mule, tended to her mother's fever. When she brought a cup of broth to Cully's lips, he drank more easily this time. The swelling in his throat had eased slightly. She wiped his mouth, gentle as mist. "You got a name?" No reply. "That's all right. Names don't matter none till someone says 'em kindly." The second day, he tried to sit up. She stopped him with a hand. "Not yet. Rest don't mean weakness." That made something flicker in his face. Not a smile. Not yet. But a shift. A softening. By the third day, she noticed his eyes lingered on her longer. Not suspiciously, curiously. Like he was trying to piece together how she fit into the world that had otherwise turned its back on him. And maybe, somewhere deep in her own quiet, she wondered the same. That evening, Lena brushed his tangled hair. He didn't flinch. She braided it loosely to keep it off the wound. Her fingers moved like memory. "My daddy said settler girls ought to be tough," she murmured. "So I learned how to stitch, grow tobacco, and shoot a rifle." He left anyway. She didn't know why she told him that, but it felt right. When she finished the braid, she looked down and saw his fingers twitching toward the edge of the quilt. She placed her hand beside his. Let him decide. After a moment, his fingers brushed hers. A whisper of thanks he didn't know how to speak yet. The next morning, she woke to find him sitting up, watching the door like he expected someone to come through it swinging hate. She brought him a cup of water and didn't speak. He drank slowly. Then a rasp low and dry. "Why?" She looked at him for a long time. Not startled. Not proud. "Because you were left like I was." The fire crackled behind them. The desert outside swelled with gold and dust. And though he didn't say another word, he nodded once. A slow, solemn bow. As if something ancient had passed between them. A promise neither had asked for, but both would keep. The past still breathed down their necks. The future was a wild, broken trail. But for now, for this sliver of silence, they weren't alone. And that was enough to go on. The wind softened in the days that followed, as if the land itself had drawn its breath in reverence. Time lost its teeth inside the wooden walls of Lena's cabin. The outside world, sharp, whispering, suspicious, remained distant, like a bad dream told in daylight. Inside, everything slowed. Broth boiled gently on the stove. The fire crackled. A quilt was pulled and tugged and readjusted with quiet care. Cully healed in silence. He hadn't spoken again, though his eyes had begun to hold more than pain. They followed Lena through the room, not possessively, not warily, but with the soft attention of someone unfamiliar with kindness and uncertain if it could last. He studied how she moved, how she spoke to her mother with a gentleness that never asked for thanks. He noticed she always hummed while working, a low tune that carried no real melody, just rhythm, a pulse of presence. Her mother, Ruth Walker, rarely left the back room now. She drifted between fever and sleep, her bones grown small beneath the quilt Lena had sewn the winter her father left. Lena sat with her in the evenings, spooning willow tea to cracked lips, whispering stories with no beginnings or ends. She never introduced Cully to her mother. Perhaps she didn't need to. By the fourth morning, he stood. He leaned heavily on the wall, breath shallow, but upright. Lena saw him from the doorway, a basket on her hip, and paused. She said nothing, only offered a slow nod. He nodded back. That was all. They shared breakfast at the hearth, her porridge thickened with ground pine nuts, his portion salted with a pinch of what she traded for last spring. He didn't speak, but he chewed slowly, eyes fixed on the flames. She found herself watching the way his fingers held the tin bowl, carefully, reverently, as if the warmth might vanish if he clutched too hard. Later that day, she brought in firewood. When she turned, he was beside her, slower than breath, but steady. He took half the load into his own arms. She blinked at him. He didn't meet her gaze. Just walked inside, bare feet whispering across the floorboards. They fell into rhythm, without planning it. He tended the garden, pulling weeds with fingers calloused, but precise. She mended clothes on the porch, eyes drifting to the hills when his figure disappeared behind them. At night, he carved small figures from cedar blocks she found in her father's abandoned workshed. Hawks, snakes, a wolf's head. He never explained their meaning. She never asked. He slept near the fire, she in the back room, on a straw mattress between her mother and the drafty window. Each night before bed, she left an extra blanket folded near him. Each morning, it was neatly replaced. Once, during a warm dusk, Lena stepped outside to gather the last of the evening's eggs. She paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. Cully was sitting by the edge of the fence line, face turned toward the setting sun. His back was to her, but his stillness spoke of something deep. The sky behind him flared with orange and violet, turning his silhouette into something almost mythic. She watched him and wondered if he missed the people who left him. That night, as they both sat by the fire, she spoke softly. I used to think loneliness was punishment, but sometimes I wonder if it's just peace waiting to be seen. He turned to her, slowly, his face unreadable, but his eyes brighter than before. You speak like the rain, he said at last, voice gravel-thick, low. She didn't reply, but her lips curved into something near a smile. The first visitor came 2 days later. Tommy James, a boy no older than 13, gangly and always sniffing like he'd caught the scent of gossip. He came hauling a basket of goods for Mrs. Elspeth, the widow up the ridge. Lena met him at the gate. She said he was low on soap and thread, Tommy said, eyes darting toward the window. Lena reached for the basket. She also said you ought to stop talking to ghosts, he added, voice lighter than his meaning. Lena stiffened. No ghosts here. Then who's that man? Tommy's chin jerked toward the side of the cabin. Cully had stepped out into the sun, no shame in his posture. No fear either. Tommy stared. He's a... Lena's voice was calm. He's a man. Tommy squinted, unsure if bravery or madness lived in her chest. He left soon after. That evening, Lena found Cully carving again. She sat beside him, her knees drawn up beneath her chin. They'll talk, she said. He nodded. Say, I've gone soft in the head. Taken up with someone dangerous. Am I dangerous? He asked. She didn't look at him. You were left to die for sparing a child. I've known folk dangerous for less. He set the carving down. It was a hawk this time, wings spread. She picked it up, turning it in her fingers. I never asked what your name meant. Cully hesitated. It means a sprout, a young shoot. She smiled, half a whisper of one. Seems right. You're still growing. The days turned gentle again. Cully built a small pen for the chickens without being asked. He repaired the porch step where Lena had tripped 2 winters ago. They rarely spoke more than needed, but silence became a comfort, not emptiness, but presence. One night, as rain began tapping the roof, Lena fetched a book from the shelf. Leather-bound, pages worn thin. Her mother had once read to her from it when storms made the house shake. She sat by the fire and opened it. You mind? She asked. Cully shook his head. She read, her voice soft, steady, slipping between the rhythm of water and wood. He watched her, not just her mouth, but her hands, the way they moved as if conducting invisible threads in the air. Her mother stirred in the next room, but didn't wake. Cully closed his eyes. Sleep came easier now. The next day brought another visitor, Mrs. Elspeth herself. She came leaning hard on her cane, blind eyes clouded, but wide open in the way of women who'd seen too much and lived to tell it. Lena met her on the path. Didn't send Tommy this time? No. Thought I'd hear for myself what kind of ghost you're entertaining. Lena stiffened, but Elspeth just smiled. Easy, child. I don't spook easy. You know that. They sat on the porch, Elspeth sipping strong tea. Cully stayed in the garden, his presence calm, like a shadow that chose not to hide. Elspeth tilted her head. That man don't move like he means harm. Lena nodded. Elspeth took another sip. Folk will start talking. They already are. And you care. I care if they come swinging rope instead of words. The old woman chuckled. Let him come. You're your mother's daughter. Ruth would have done the same. When Elspeth left, she patted Lena's hand. You've got a fire in you. Just don't burn down the good with the rest. The wind shifted that night, sharper, like it remembered what world this was. Cully stood at the window long after the fire had gone to coals. They'll come, won't they? He asked. Lena stirred from where she sat curled on the floor. Yes. Will you let them take me? She didn't answer at first. Then, with quiet certainty, no. He turned to her, his face unreadable in the shadows. She met his gaze. I won't let them take what the desert gave back. The silence between them was different now. Heavy, honest. He stepped closer. Then I'll stay. And I'll stand when it comes. She nodded once. And though no promises were spoken, something passed between them, solid as stone, soft as dusk. They would not run. Whatever came, they would face it together. And outside, the desert waited, holding its breath. The air changed before the trouble came. Not with thunder, not with warning. Just a quiet shift in the way the wind curled around the porch posts, in how the mule grew restless at night, in the way Lena found herself watching the horizon without knowing why. It was early spring, and the snow that clung to the mountain's ribs began to loosen. Water crept down through the dry creek beds in fits and starts, carving new paths through old places. Cully worked beside her now, not as a guest, but as someone returning to himself. He moved with steadiness, never rushed. His shoulder had healed into a deep seam of silver. The limp in his leg faded into a subtle favoring of the right foot. But more than that, it was the way he spoke now, few words, carefully chosen, like stones stacked with purpose. He had begun teaching her to see the land the way he did. Not just the color of the sky, but the scent before the rain. Not just the sound of birds, but which one stayed when trouble stirred. You listen long enough, he said one morning. The earth will speak plain. Lena had smiled at that, her hands deep in the garden bed. I think she already has. I just wasn't ready to hear her. Each day, they built something. A new fence post. A stronger door latch. A bench beneath the cottonwood where they took their tea in the golden hour. It was a kind of building born, not of fear, but of intent. As if they both knew something was coming, and they meant to meet it standing upright. They did not speak of love, but it hung between them, quiet and growing, like the vine that crept along the cabin wall, slow, determined, rooted in silence. Then the trader came. Dust clung to his boots like bad memories. He arrived mid-morning, pulling his old sorrel gelding behind him, looking for eggs, tobacco, and maybe word of news. Lena met him by the shed with a basket in hand and a guarded smile. He squinted toward the garden, where Cully stood half-shadowed behind the peach tree. That your new help? Just a friend passing through. Looks like he's staying. Lena didn't respond. The trader scratched his beard. Folk in town want to know who he is. They already think they do. The man took his goods, handed over a few coins, and rode off. But not before glancing back once more, long enough to memorize what he saw. That night, Lena sat at the window with the oil lamp turned low. Her fingers twisted the hem of her apron, nodding and unnodding. They'll come soon, she said. Cully sat across from her, sharpening a blade slowly, not for use, but to keep his hands busy. I know. I don't want to be afraid again. You're not. I am. He set the blade down. Then be it, he said quietly. But don't let it stop you. The words settled deep in her, like warm stones in cold hands. 2 days later, the sheriff came. His horse was clean-shod, his boots polished, his voice full of the false warmth that comes before a fire gets out of control. Sheriff Dunn had once courted Lena, back when her father was alive, back when her mother's eyes still held the light of spring. He'd called her pretty once, in a lazy way, like it might have been true if she'd smiled more or worn brighter dresses. Now, he stepped down from the saddle with too much ease. Afternoon, Lena. She stood on the porch with her arms folded, chin high. Sheriff, I hear you've taken in a guest. She said nothing. He stepped closer. Folk are nervous. You know how it is. Stranger shows up, keeps to himself. Rumors run wild. He's not a threat. Maybe not to you. Her jaw tightened. He saved my life in more ways than you'd care to understand. Dunn's smile thinned. I ain't here to start trouble. Just to make sure there ain't any brewin'. You understand. Behind her, Cully stepped into view. He didn't speak, just looked at Dunn with the stillness of a man who'd already endured more than most could imagine. The sheriff shifted his weight. You don't belong here, he said. Cully held his gaze. Neither did your ancestors. The moment stretched thin as rawhide. Lena stepped between them. If you've said your piece, Sheriff, you're welcome to leave. His eyes flicked to her. You always did have a stubborn streak. She didn't reply. He tipped his hat, more out of habit than respect, and mounted his horse. As he rode off, Cully watched him until the dust settled. He'll be back, he said. I know. That evening, they sat on the porch with coffee in tin mugs. The wind smelled of rain and horses. Lena leaned her shoulder against Cully's, her head just beneath his chin. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When her mother passed 2 nights later, it was without sound. Ruth Walker had faded gently, like the last ember in a hearth, releasing her final breath into the dark like a prayer no one had words for. Lena found her in the morning, hands folded on her chest, a faint smile on her lips. Peaceful, as if she'd seen something on her way out worth believing in. Lena wept quietly, long and slow. Cully didn't say anything. He just stood behind her as she washed her mother's face, combed her hair, lit the candles. They buried her beneath the cottonwood, where the roots could keep her company. After the service, just the two of them, and the wind. Lena sat by the grave, her fingers brushing the fresh-turned soil. She taught me how to make bread, how to dress wounds, how to tell stories. She told me love don't always look the way you think it should. Cully knelt beside her. She taught you well. The words were not comfort. They were truth. That night, as the storm rolled in, Lena found herself at the edge of the porch, watching lightning claw across the sky. She's free now, she whispered. Cully stood beside her, close enough that his warmth brushed against her skin. You are too. They turned toward each other. The silence between them was thick with knowing. Still, they did not kiss. Not yet. There was something sacred about waiting. And then came the knock. Hard, loud, demanding. Lena opened the door to find 3 men standing under the dripping eaves, Dunn and 2 others, both strangers with rifles. We're not here to talk this time, the sheriff said. Town council wants him gone. We're here to see it done. Cully stepped into view, his face unreadable. Lena's voice didn't tremble. You're trespassing. This ain't a negotiation. She stepped forward, rain dripping from her hair. Then you'll have to drag me off with him. The men hesitated. Dunn looked past her, into the cabin where firelight danced on old walls. He saw something he hadn't before. Not fear, not weakness. Strength made of quiet things. You're really going to throw your lot in with him? He asked. Lena held his gaze. He stayed when others left. He listened when no one else did. He's not my burden. He's my choice. The wind rose behind her, full of rain and the memory of things left unsaid. Dunn didn't move, but something in him shifted. He turned to his men. Let's go. One of them frowned. You serious? He didn't repeat himself. They disappeared into the storm. Lena stood in the doorway long after the sound of hooves faded. When she turned, Cully was watching her. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. And then, as if the storm had broken something open, they moved toward each other, slow, certain. like rivers finding their way through rock. He reached for her face. She let him. No words passed, just warmth and understanding, and something that felt like the beginning of forever. Outside, the ashes of the fire curled in the wind, glowing soft. And in the shelter they had built, between pain and promise, between silence and truth, a new ember caught flame. Morning broke hard and cold. The storm had passed, but it left behind a strange stillness, as if the world was holding its breath again. Clouds drifted low over the hills, like smoke from an unseen fire. The soil was damp beneath the peach tree, water still clinging to each blade of grass, like memory. Inside the cabin, everything was quiet, too quiet. Lena stood at the window, mug in hand, watching the horizon where the land met the sky. Her braid hung loose over one shoulder, damp at the ends. The warmth from the stove hadn't yet touched her skin. Something inside her knew today would not be ordinary. Cully moved behind her, silent as always. He touched her back, barely, just enough to say, "I'm here." She didn't turn, but her shoulders relaxed. For a moment they said nothing. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "They'll be back." Cully nodded. "They'll bring more men." He nodded again. She turned now, eyes steady. "We can leave. If we leave now, we might make it to Salt River before nightfall." No, it was not defiance. It was clarity. He touched the necklace he now wore, a thin strip of leather with a carved hawk hanging from it. Her carving. His hand brushed it like a prayer. "I won't run from what I already survived." Lena stepped closer. "They won't see you as a man. They'll see you as something to put back in the ground." "I know." She looked away, her hands clenched at her sides, then relaxed. "I don't want to lose this." "You won't. You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I've lived through being half dead. And I'd rather be fully alive for a short while than silent and invisible for the rest of my days." She pressed her forehead against his chest. He rested his chin atop her head. They stood like that for a long time. By mid-morning, the first rider appeared. Then another. Then 4 more. 12 in all. The dust they kicked up rolled ahead of them like a warning bell. Rifles. Rope. Hard eyes. No flags. No official seals. Just men with a taste for righteousness and blood. Sheriff Dunn was not with them. These weren't lawmen. They were the kind of men who acted when silence lasted too long, when fear turned to gossip and gossip turned to hate. The kind who believed justice was something you carved from bone. Lena watched them come from the porch. Cully stood beside her, arms loose at his sides, eyes fixed forward. "They'll ask for you." "They won't need to." The men dismounted without urgency, as if this was simply a job. One man, tall and gaunt with a gray beard and a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He didn't bother with a greeting. "We're here for the Navajo." Lena stepped forward. "His name is Cully. That ain't what matters." "It matters to me." The man ignored her. His eyes were on Cully, sharp and appraising. "You gonna come quiet?" "No." He didn't shout it. Just said it like it was the only word left. One of the men reached for his rifle. Cully didn't flinch. Lena stepped in front of him. "You'll shoot me first." A murmur rolled through the group. Some of the men looked uneasy. Others shifted on their boots, itching for something to start. Then a voice rose from behind them. "That's enough." The crowd parted to reveal a figure on horseback. Mrs. Elspeth. Tommy stood beside her, holding the reins. Behind them, 2 other townsfolk, quiet people overlooked, carried their own rifles, their faces grim. The old woman's voice rang out clearer than her body should have allowed. "You come for blood, you'll spill more than you take." Scar Cheek turned toward her. "This ain't your fight." "It is now," she said. "Because I remember a time we left a man hanging and spent 30 years regretting it." She coughed hard. Tommy steadied her. "You think you're right because you're loud. But loud ain't never meant right." One of the men looked uncertain. Another lowered his rifle. Scar Cheek sneered. "You'd protect a savage?" Cully stepped forward now. "I was left by my own people for refusing to kill a child. I bled alone. She saved me. She fed me. And still, I made no claim to this land." He turned to the gathered men. "But I will now." He reached down, picked up a handful of the damp soil near the porch, and let it fall through his fingers. "This is where I was given life again, and I won't leave it." Lena's voice was next, low and sure. "You'll have to bury us both if you want to take him." The standoff hung there, tight, silent, ready to break. And then Sheriff Dunn rode up the trail, dusted in road and regret. He looked older than he had weeks ago, tired, torn. He dismounted slowly and walked into the space between Lena and the angry men. "I didn't sanction this." Scarcheek barked a laugh. "You too soft now, Sheriff." Dunn didn't answer. He looked at Lena, then Cully, then back to the crowd. "We've got a long history in this town of taking more than we give, of judging before knowing. Maybe it's time that ends." Silence. Raw, ragged silence. Then, slowly, one man turned his horse. Another followed. A third spat in the dirt, then rode off. Scarcheek lingered, face hard. He met Cully's gaze. Something passed between them. Anger, maybe. Or respect, unwillingly granted. Then he turned and mounted his horse, without another word. The rest followed. Soon the dust settled, and the only sound was the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Mrs. Elspeth gave a little sigh. "Well, that's settled then." She turned her horse. Tommy waved awkwardly at Lena, then trotted after her. Dunn stood a moment longer. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "You don't have to," Lena replied. He nodded once and walked back to his horse. They watched him go. Later, Lena and Cully stood beneath the cottonwood where Ruth was buried. The breeze danced through the branches, sunlight flickering like fireflies. Cully touched the tree trunk, calloused fingers, finding the knots. "I never meant to stay here." "I never meant to fall in love," Lena whispered. He looked at her, not with surprise, but with quiet recognition, like something sacred had finally spoken its name. She stepped into his arms, and for the first time they kissed. It was not urgent. It was not stolen. It was an answer. That night they lit a fire in the hearth and made bread together, her hands teaching his, flour rising in laughter. The wind curled around the cabin like a lullaby. Outside, the stars stitched themselves back into the sky. And somewhere beyond, the desert exhaled. Tomorrow might bring new trials. But tonight they had peace and warmth and each other. And that would be enough.